Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akiriduluale, the headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Sievieredonetsk and Lysychansk are dead cities. Russia's UN envoy storms out of the Security Council meeting as the EU accuses Russia of fueling global food crisis. And United States wins authority to seize a Roman Abramovich's aircraft. We'll begin the program this morning with more on the situation in the twin Donbas cities of Sievieredonetsk and Lysychansk. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Russian forces had the numerical advantage in the battle for the eastern city of Sievieredonetsk, but that Ukraine's forces had every chance of fighting back. Mr. Zelensky told reporters at a briefing in Kiev that the situation would become very difficult for Ukraine if Russia breaks through in the eastern region of Donbas. Sitting each side of a strategically important river, Sievieredonetsk and Lysychansk have been all but destroyed as Russian artillery units try to pound the Ukrainian defenders into submission. President Zelensky said they are dead cities, all but devoid of life.
We have a difficult situation in the east. You know the situation in Sievierodonetsk. We are maintaining the situation. They outnumber us. They are more powerful. But nevertheless, I think we have every chance to fight in this axis. 10% of the population are there. 10 to 15% of the population remain there. That's what we understand. In Lysychansk, the situation is roughly the same. However, when you drive across Lysychansk, there's a feeling that there is no one there. That's what I say. I do not know where they are. They are not there. There are no people on the streets, except for our military, and someone appearing. That's the feeling of what's going on. You also need to understand that if you fall back to better positions, it will be very costly to return in terms of the number of your people killed and casualties. Then it will be very costly. Many people are saying that we need to take back everything, every town. They need to know the price of these steps. Now, we stand and lose people. Then we fall back to better positions. And if we decide to advance, we lose many, many more.
President Zelensky also thanked British Prime Minister Boris Johnson for sending Ukraine exactly the weapons it needs to fight the war with Russia. Earlier, the United Kingdom had said that in coordination with the United States, it would supply Ukraine with multiple launch rocket systems that can attack targets up to 80 kilometers away as part of a new military aid package for Kiev. In his nightly video address, Mr. Zelensky said he was grateful to Prime Minister Johnson for the complete understanding of his country's demands and the preparedness to provide Ukraine with exactly the weapons that it needs so as to protect the lives of its people. The governor of Luhansk says Russian forces are maintaining their attack on Sievierodonetsk as the battle for the key eastern city continues. Serhiy Haidar says Russian forces shelled the town of Zilote on Monday morning and destroyed 13 houses in one go. Mr. Haidar also said that 2 people were injured in the shelling of a school and a market in Lysychansk caught fire. He mentioned that 3 more people were injured in Lysychansk but did not specify if these injuries were related to the fire or a separate incident. And Ukraine says 263 children have been killed as a result of Russia's invasion and subsequent conflict, while more than 467 have been injured. The Office of the Prosecutor General says work is still underway to establish the number of casualties in places of active hostilities, temporarily occupied and liberated territories. The highest number of children who suffered were in the Donetsk region. That's at 190, followed by Kiev at 116. Kharkiv has 112, Chernihiv 68, Luhansk 53. European Council President Charles Michel has accused Russia of using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries and blamed the Kremlin for a looming global food crisis, prompting Moscow's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia to walk out of a Security Council meeting. Michel addressed Russian ambassadors directly at the meeting, saying he saw millions of tons of grain and wheat stock in containers and ships at the Ukrainian port of Odessa a few weeks ago because of Russian warships in the Black Sea. Michel had also accused Russian troops of war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically citing reports of sexual violence, the focus of the Security Council meeting, and describing it as a tactic of torture, terror, and repression. During his own statement earlier in the meeting, Ambassador Nebenzia had categorically refuted any accusations of sexual violence by Russian soldiers, condemning what he said was a lie. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is trying to broker what he calls a package deal to resume Ukrainian food exports and Russian food and fertilizer exports. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is due to visit Turkey tomorrow to discuss unlocking grain exports from Ukraine.
Of the Russian Federation, let's be honest, the Kremlin is using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries. The dramatic consequences of Russia's war are spilling over across the globe, and this is driving up food prices, pushing people into poverty and destabilizing entire regions. And Russia is solely responsible for this food crisis, Russia alone, despite the Kremlin's campaign of lies and disinformation. I've seen it with my own eyes a few weeks ago in Odessa. Millions of tons of grain and wheat stuck in containers and ships because of Russian warships in the Black Sea and because of Russia's attack on transport infrastructure. And it is Russian tanks, Russian bombs and mines that are preventing Ukraine from planting and harvesting. The Kremlin is also targeting grain storages and stealing grain in Ukraine while shifting the blame on others. This is cowardly, this is propaganda, pure and simple propaganda. Let's get to the facts. The EU has no sanctions on the agricultural sector in Russia, zero. And even our sanctions on the Russian transport sector do not go beyond our EU borders. You may leave the room, maybe it's easier not to listen to the truth, the ambassador. We hear reports of Russian forces wielding sexual violence as a weapon of war. Sexual violence is a war crime, a crime against humanity, a tactic of torture, terror, and repression. Shameful acts in a shameful war. And this must be exposed to the light of day and prosecuted without impunity.
U.S. authorities are pushing to seize 2 luxury jets linked to Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich after a federal magistrate judge signed a warrant approving the move. One of the planes is believed to have been in Moscow since March 15, according to a Justice Department affidavit. The other, meanwhile, is believed to be in Dubai following a round-trip flight from the United Arab Emirates to Russia, according to the affidavit. Department of Justice officials said the planes were not in U.S. custody, and the official declined to say if the U.S. government knows their locations. A federal judge in Manhattan issued the warrants on the grounds that recent flights violated U.S. export controls imposed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February. But the official said the warrants were likely to dissuade companies from helping to move the aircraft. U.S. authorities are seeking to pressure business leaders close to Russian President Vladimir Putin to get him to halt what Kremlin calls the special military operation in Ukraine. A spokesman for Mr. Abramovich did not immediately respond to a request for comment, but Mr. Abramovich has denied having close ties to Mr. Putin. Let's talk now to Mr. Ambrose Igboke, public affairs analyst, who joins us virtually from Enugu. Good morning to you, and thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning, Ladi. Thanks for having me.
Let's start from what we had just been reporting, the issue of food and food supplies. There are those who have argued that in war, anything goes, and if war is declared, then you don't expect anybody to comply by the rules. So Does it come to you as a surprise that much is being made of the fact that Russia is preventing Ukraine from exporting grain, and it's in its own case, it's also not allowing the normal movement of grain to countries it deems unfriendly?
Well, the part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, part of the Charter of the United Nations, and the different conventions thereof, have always stated that there are protocols when it involves war, especially international war. And one of those conventions stated that you must allow corridors, safe corridors for food, for medical facilities, and safe corridors for especially the civilian casualties of the war to move away, to move to safety. Those are standards in every war. Therefore, Russia is therefore going against international established war conventions that we're supposed to allow food to come into the country and also food to also go out, so that civilians who are trapped in the war zone can be taken care of. These things happened during the Second World War and First World War, but it is surprising that in this modern times, this kind of actions are still happening. And in all places that we can think of, it's happening in Europe. Europe that claims to be the light of civilization, Europe that claims to be the champions of democracy, Europe that claims to be the people that shows the other parts of the world the way to live civilization. It is a very disappointing, and the United Nations should wrap up all efforts to ensure that Russia desists from this act going forward.
Let's come to the conflict itself, shall we, and look at some of the facts as they stand. It does appear that from all the reports, the Russians are making slow but steady progress in the Donbas region, and as the Ukrainian president has admitted this morning, the two twin cities that they had been after for quite a number of days now have in fact become dead cities. In other words, possibly the Ukrainians are about to lose those cities to the Russians. That will open a corridor. Now, does this give you the impression that ultimately, even though there will have to be negotiations, the military facts on the ground are not going in support of Ukraine?
That is very evident. Ukraine itself knows that it cannot stand against Russia. If we can trace this historically, we remember that as part of the bargain that fell of the USSR in the 90s, Ukraine was asked to surrender its nuclear weapons, which was destroyed, and part of it was also taken by Russia, was relocated to Russia. That seems to me that Russia has planned this for a very long time, because you know that you have removed the nuclear capabilities and nuclear arsenal of Ukraine. Therefore, you have left them open. So the next thing, Russia has the nuclear capabilities and has all the war equipment. Therefore, it was easy for them to just roll into Ukraine. Russia did it in Crimea. They succeeded. Remember Ossetia, Georgia, they invaded it. So Russia is being emboldened, because when they did it, nothing happened. And also, they may be taking a cue from what happened when, for example, when the Americans invaded Iraq and some other countries. So they are becoming emboldened. And from all indication on ground, it is very clear that militarily they outclass Ukraine. And they are bent on taking those eastern region, because they are Russians speaking. And Russia believes that since they are Russian speaking, that they are part of a Russian nation, and they don't ought to be in Ukraine. So that is the strategy, and it has been deliberate. And from what I'm seeing, I am saying that the Russians might take those regions, just as they took Crimea.
Given that the situation shouldn't be that uneven, those who are listening to you would say, because Ukraine has received massive military support, everything short of boots on the ground from the West, the UK, the US. Even just this week, the United Kingdom joined the United States in promising that they would send longer range weapons to the Ukrainians. Is it that you don't think that is making as much of a difference as it should make?
Well, I don't think so. Why? I will explain. most of the weaponry that's been sent to Ukraine are actually defensive systems. They are not attacking systems. So it just means that Ukraine will sit, Russia will launch long-range missiles into Ukraine, and then for it to contain those attacks of Russia and to minimize damages, these defense equipments are being sent, like what we call the multiple launch rocket systems are being sent. The M270 that will be sent to Ukraine by UK. I mean, UK has pledged 1.3 billion pounds of military assistance. But Russia has also warned that once the US or UK or any other country sends attacking systems to Ukraine, that it will take the war a notch higher. And therefore, I don't think the UK or US will want to risk sending attack systems to Ukraine. And that is where the problem is. Because if you give defense systems to Ukraine and you don't give them attacking systems, therefore Russia is still free to attacking them. What the defense system does is to minimize damage or, do some kind of control in the damage it will cause in Ukraine. So that is why I'm saying that it is still not enough.
Let's look at the other side of this, which is attempts at peace. A lot of destruction has gone on. Significant loss of lives have happened, and both military and others on both sides. And Ukraine is in real, almost a rubble, so to speak. And as you talked about, because of the fact that many of the weapons they have are defensive, so that brings us the issue of peace talks. Do you see anything at all on the horizon that would encourage either party or both parties to now take a look at peace talks?
My prediction is that Russia will not back down until it takes those eastern regions in Donbass region. Those Russian-speaking sites, when it takes it and has total control and feels that it can annex it to Russia, just like what they did in Crimea, then they can now sit down on the table. History has also shown us that in every war, there must be, after you war, you have to judge up. Therefore, all wars end in a negotiating table. But I believe this one will also end in a negotiating table. Because as it is for now, I don't see any negotiating table coming up. Russia is playing some kind of deliberate schemes to ensure that it captures that region that is Russian-speaking, annex it to Russia, and then can now say, we are ready to talk. And that is when I think Russia will be ready to talk with anybody about this issue.
Well, before we end this conversation, I must then ask you about the outside forces. We've been discussing Russia and Ukraine, but you and I both know that this situation is not wholly Russia versus Ukraine. There are other parties that are involved. In the case of the support for Ukraine, you have Western countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and the others. In the case of Russia, you've got other countries that are indirectly, without publicizing their support, also giving some helping hand, either in the purchase of oil or in other forms of support, the likes of India, the likes of China, and so on. These outside forces, could they play a role in bringing the two major parties to the table?
Well, I will say boldly that the war in the first place was actually caused by these outside forces. So you are right that they can bring it together. We remember that the Cold War did not end. The Cold War of the 60s and the 70s did not actually end. It just simmered down. So the West Bloc and the East Bloc is still there, fighting shadow wars. And Ukraine, unluckily, has to be a pawn in the chess game of war that is currently going on. What is causing it? What has caused it that NATO's, Ukraine's move to join NATO? And Russia has said that, no, you cannot join NATO because this was a treaty we signed that you will not come out, NATO will not be around Russian borders. And Russia feels that that treaty has been, jettisoned. And therefore, they said if any attempt to do that, then Ukraine wanted to join NATO. And that is the genesis of this invasion by Russia. Therefore, when the rhetoric from the West tones down, and when the rhetoric from the East tones down, then these outside forces can now come together and say, okay, let's stop this war. The war is actually a function of outside forces, not a function of Ukraine. Ukraine is just a pawn in the chess game of these global interests.
Unfortunately, a grim reality there. But thank you very much, Mr. Ambrose Igboke, for your views this morning. Thank you for your time on the program.
Thank you, Vladi, for having me this morning.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson has won the backing of a majority of Conservative members of Parliament in a confidence vote, despite a significant revolt against his leadership. The Prime Minister won 59% of the vote, meaning he is now immune from a Conservative leadership challenge for 1 year. In all, 211 MPs voted that they had confidence in the PM's leadership, while 148 voted against him. Mr. Johnson described his confidence vote win as decisive. The result sees the Prime Minister remain in office, but critics said the scale of the rebellion against him showed his authority had been weakened, with some calling on him to resign. Let's talk now to our London correspondent, Juliana Olayinka, who joins us from somewhere within the transport system in the United Kingdom. Good morning to you, Juliana.
Good morning, Laddie.
So, we discussed this yesterday, but Boris Johnson, the Teflon King, seems to have survived once more.
He has survived once more, but I think even Boris Johnson's closest allies would say this is the beginning of the end. As you said, he suffered a bruising no vote of confidence from 148 of his own MPs. That is a worse result than what Theresa May saw when she had a vote of no confidence, and she was out of office within 6 months. I think the press conference following the announcement of the result, as well as the press release that Downing Street have released this morning, really reeks of embarrassment. They are trying to say, let's move on. There's nothing to see here. Let's move forward and continue for the country. But I think for the Conservative Party, as well as the entire Palace of Westminster, they think that if a third of your MPs say that you're not fit to lead, then you should take that result and resign.
Given that scenario, though, some of the policies, I'm sure the Ukrainian leadership will be heaving some sigh of relief because they're expected to receive some weapons from the United Kingdom in short order. And if there's a change of leadership at this point, that may not be immediately forthcoming. But there are other implications to all of this. Part of the report is that because he has survived this, 59% of the vote, and he's now immune for at least 1 year from another leadership challenge. How is that playing out on the ground there?
Well, it's interesting you say that, Laddie, because yesterday you were asking me at about the same time whether or not the 1922 committee would be changing the rules, because the rules do state if you win a vote of confidence, a ballot, then you are immune from another election within a year. But already desperate MPs are trying to rally themselves, the rebels, and try and get these rules changed. So it could be within 6 months. You did mention Ukraine, which is really important because the Conservative Party, particularly Boris Johnson and his allies in Ukraine, would like to believe that Britain are leading the Western allies. However, some people think that's a British myth, that it's something the Tory party are trying to spin, that the EU have also been really fundamental in trying to crack down on Putin's reign. So that's not going to stick. And ultimately, I think the backlash against Prime Minister Boris Johnson isn't about policy. It's about personality. And I don't think that, a third of the party are going to change their mind anytime soon. Some political pundits in the UK say this is just the tip of the iceberg, that many of his public allies went into the secret ballot, gritting their teeth, ticking the box, yes, but do they have confidence in him? They don't.
This is all sounding a bit funny to those who have been following Boris Johnson in politics. And remember that when he won the elections that brought him to power, after he got power in the aftermath of Theresa May's exit, that everyone knew who Boris Johnson was and that they voted for him. They made him first prime minister, and then he was elected prime minister by the country. in spite of that. So why is all of this coming as a surprise all of a sudden? Many of the things that are now scandalous, people already knew that Boris Johnson was not, shall we say, the most conventional person, and yet they put him in power.
I think you've provided a really good backdrop of who Boris Johnson is, but then you've got to remember that part of the British establishment and many of Boris Johnson's closest friends and allies are part of the British media. And I think in the kind of Donald Trump populism era that we experienced just before the pandemic, people like populist, sloganist leaders, and Boris Johnson he completely fitted the bill. And of course, he did have that resounding a victory in the 2019 election. He was able to get Brexit done. But again, I think in modern day politics, you're not really looking back at a future leader's past victories. You want to see exactly what policies are going to be put forward. And I think, Boris Johnson has completely debased the political office, some people would say, and some Tory MPs just cannot allow him to do so anymore. And I think with him, it's everything that you laid out. It's all about his personality. It's about his CV. This is more than being able to rally people round at the ballot. This is about who he is. And for many people in the Conservative Party, and I think across the country now, it's time for him to go.
Just before I let you go, Juliana, I must ask, of course, if indeed any of these plans come to fruition and Boris Johnson is shown the door as Prime Minister, the Conservatives may then be having different calculations. One of the things that had been said in the past is that right now there are no obvious successors to him who can immediately take the saddle and take the party and the country in a different direction, and that so this might be the first couple of steps to probably another general election, which the Labour Party, or indeed one of the other parties, may then end up playing kingmaker and the Conservatives may be out of office. Wouldn't that be giving the Conservatives some pause?
That's a really good point. And thank you for mentioning the snap general election, because that's buzzing around Westminster at the moment. I think, if you are playing at the top of political parties as you are with Boris Johnson, then clearly you need a mandate from the public. So there are suggestions that perhaps there would be a snap general election. But this snap general election would be called by Prime Minister Boris Johnson because he obviously would want to show the third of the party that didn't back him, that he has the support from the general public. But is this going to work? So John Major tried to do it after his vote of confidence in his period. And we know that Tony Blair had a resounding victory. So potentially this could play into the hands of the Labour Party. But a lot of people also don't trust the Labour Party at the moment. So Keir Starmer, the opposition leader, he is currently under criminal investigation because he was caught drinking beer at a late night curry dinner in Durham on the eve of an election campaign. He said he will resign if the police do indeed find him. But now, because of the scandal surrounding Partygate, the rules governing lockdown parties have gone completely off the stratosphere. So it's very possible that Sir Keir Starmer will receive a fine. He will have to vote. Will the British public vote for the Labour Party? It's all to play for. But to kind of wrap it up in conclusion, Laddie, I would certainly say that even those closest to Boris Johnson believe that he is deeply wounded. He should do the right thing. He should resign from the party and hand it over to somebody who can take the country forward.
Indeed, Juliana, we'll wait to see if he does that. Our correspondent Juliana Olayinka there from the British capital. Do stay safe and keep moving through, as you say, the British transport system, even with the hiccups. Thanks, Juliana.
Thank you. Thanks, Laddie.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says there are credible reports that Russia is, quote, pilfering Ukraine's grain exports to sell for profit. Speaking during a virtual roundtable with philanthropies, non-governmental organizations and private sector entities, Mr. Blinken said the alleged theft was part of broader Russian actions during its war in Ukraine that have hit Ukraine's ability to export its wheat crop and worsened the global food security crisis. Ukraine has accused Russia of shipping Ukrainian grain to countries including Turkey and Syria.
a Russian naval blockade in the Black Sea is preventing Ukraine's crops from being shipped to their normal destinations. There are somewhere around 20 million tons of wheat that's trapped in silos near Odessa and in ships literally filled with grain that are stuck in the Odessa port because of this Russian blockade. Russian forces have captured some of Ukraine's most productive farmland. They planted explosives throughout the fields. They've destroyed vital agricultural infrastructure. There are credible reports, including, as we saw in one of our leading newspapers today, that Russia is pilfering Ukraine's grain exports, to sell for its own profit. Now, Russia is hoarding its food exports as well. So this is all deliberate. We know that. President Putin is stopping food from being shipped and aggressively using his propaganda machine to deflect or distort responsibility because it hopes it'll get the world to give in to him and end the sanctions. In other words, quite simply put, it's blackmail.
America's ability to provide sufficient electricity is under threat, partly because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that statement is made by U.S. President Joe Biden, who has blamed Russia for a looming crisis in the United States, saying his country might not be able to generate enough electricity to meet consumer demand. Mr. Biden invoked the Defense Production Act, originally part of an industrial mobilization effort in response to the Korean War, to spur domestic production of solar panels and other forms of clean energy to boost power supplies. Mr. Biden's emergency declaration included a 2-year exemption from tariffs on solar panels from 4 Southeast Asian countries. The proposed tariffs had been blamed for delaying major solar projects in the U.S. About 3/4 of the solar modules installed in the United States are imported from Southeast Asia. The president has blamed Russia for a record U.S. fuel prices and a surge in inflation to a 40-year high. He has also attributed a looming global food crisis to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Let's talk to Laddie Williams, as we always do at this time this week. Hi, Laddie. Morning. So let's start with car sales.
Yeah.
Some would say that's expected, that many people in war situations don't buy cars.
Right, and with the mass exodus, we've seen, of these car makers from Russia, especially the French car maker Renault. We saw them leave, and they had, quite a major stake with the local car manufacturing plant that's Avtovaz, manufacturer. They had a big share there, and they produce the most affordable car there. It's called the Lada in Russia. And
many Nigerians are familiar with that.
Exactly. And seeing all these companies, move out of Russia, especially Renault actually leaving their most of their assets in Russia. That was the first nationalization we actually saw, right. With this exodus from Russia. And, all of this has impacted, car sales in the country. New cars, the car sales have dropped by about 84%. We saw that start in about April. We saw that drop for about 78% in April for car sales. And now May has followed. So we're seeing most of these sanctions actually biting, at this point. And we also see that mechanics, their local mechanics, are also having problems, getting parts, because we've seen the likes of Honda, Audi. They've all
cut off
sales of cars and parts, in Russia. So mechanics are worried right now in Russia that they might not be able to get parts to actually fix their client cars, because they're running out of stock and there's no end in sight. They can't see the stocks actually
coming back
anytime soon if this war continues and escalates. So that's one major headache they have right now.
Russia is cutting its key interest rate by 100 basis points,
yep.
10%.
Another big cut.
What's the game plan?
When the world is hiking,
right.
Major central bankers are hiking, and even Ukraine, we saw Ukraine actually hike from 10% to about
25%.
Yeah, 25. And here we see Russia here,
headed in the opposite direction.
In the opposite direction. But it's all because the first hike, was quite sudden. It was to stabilize the economy, because when those the sanctions hit, we saw how the ruble plummeted, and how locals there were trying to move funds out of country. So they had to make that a sharp move, raising the rates. But now everything is stabilized now. We're seeing the ruble actually strengthen, and it's time to start bringing those rates down to the normal level, even though it's still high, but it's time to bring it down, so that they can actually see the true, value of the ruble, make sure, borrowing is cheaper to spur the economy at this point, because that obviously, stagnated the economy, increasing the cost of borrowing to that, high level. So, things are stabilizing now. They're saying, it's time to bring it, back down. We've seen Russia, actually, Ukraine, they made this move by hiking rates to try and protect the hryvnia, that's their currency. And we might see, more rate hikes, if things don't stabilize there. But for Russia now, Friday, the consensus is they're going to reduce rates to about 10%, which is quite unexpected, at a time, like this.
We talked about this last week with the business desk. India's potash rupee payment deal,
right?
Which everyone was saying, look, this could be a really a game changer for both sides. But it's now in trouble.
Yeah, it's in trouble, because at the end of the day, these sanctions are still biting. The rupee-ruble swap is a good deal, to move away from dependence from the US dollar and euro. But at the same time now, we're seeing India have to be careful, at this moment, because we know how, the US and their allies, there's still secondary sanctions. So right now, India's being careful and saying, you know what, let's watch out. Let's see if there'll be some kind of de-escalation, with this war, so that to, spur back that whole rupee-ruble conversion, because that would actually, help their bilateral trade, make it seamless. But with these sanctions, it cannot, we cannot move forward with such a deal right now, because that could actually, translate to more geopolitical tensions.
Crisis. And now drawing in India
into the mix. So they're being quite careful now, which is expected. But if there's a de-escalation, we can't see that deal actually come back.
Before I let you go, we must talk about Nigeria's own economy. Manufacturers are losing confidence. Because, among other things, there's falling disposable income. High inventory rates, goods are not moving as fast as they can. What one would say, should this really surprise us? Because over the last 15 or so weeks, you and I and Ini have been talking about all the various things.
The macros are not looking so good. And obviously, with the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, they have this index, the Manufacturer Confidence Index, that shows, the strength of the economy, how much confidence, manufacturers have in the economy. And it was quite improved in the fourth quarter of 2021 at about 55 points. But now we've seen that pull back to about 53 points, about 1.5 point drop, from what we had, which is showing that, confidence is, being tapered at this point in the economy. All of this, we're seeing how, the war in Ukraine has impacted, inputs, for manufacturers. We've seen how diesel has skyrocketed. And what the manufacturers use is they look at business situation right now, and for the next 3 months, they look at employment rates, present employment rate, and for the next 3 months, they put all of this together, and about 40 CEOs, have to, fill a survey. And from what they've seen, the economy is actually facing a lot of headwinds right now. And manufacturers are, we've seen them actually try to stock up to make up for inventory, and they're actually holding more than they actually need, at the moment, because of they're expecting, future shortages for their input. So all of this is adding to their cost, their cost of production, and obviously with squeezed incomes from, the households, that's also impacting, demand at this point. So it's expected, and at the end of the day, they're appealing to the government to,
come to some aid,
yes,
provide some kind of buffer.
Maybe take away some attention from politics, and bring it back to the economy so we can see how we can spur, economic development. But we know it's all about politics right now.
And a fat chance of that happening.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laddie. Of course, there are updates of that and all the other stories about which we haven't tackled on the program now. After this on Business Morning, and then later on Business Incorporated.
Thank you.
The United States has accused the Kremlin of a full assault on media freedom. Russia had warned U.S. news organizations they risk being stripped of their accreditation unless the treatment of Russian journalists in the United States improves. The United States has reported it continues to issue visas to qualified Russian journalists and has not revoked the foreign press credentials of any Russian journalists.
Access to information and the truth. The Russians continue to make a false equivalency. The Russian government fundamentally and willfully disregards what it means to have a free press, as evidenced by them blocking or banning nearly every independent Russian outlet seeking to report inside their country. Threatening professional journalists for simply trying to do their jobs and seeking to seal off Russia's population from any foreign information illustrates the flimsiness and the fragility of the Russian government's narrative. The United States continues to issue visas to qualified Russian journalists, and we have not revoked the foreign press center credentials of any Russian journalists working in the United States. Even the Kremlin's efforts to clamp down on the organs of information, and even their efforts to intimidate reporters have failed, and information continues to make its way through what is undoubtedly a very constricted information environment. The Russian government, the Kremlin, has a long track record of pursuing those who have attempted to put a spotlight on it, including its security services. And of course, history is unfortunately riddled with examples of independent journalists and truth tellers whose reporting has been suppressed or, in some cases, much worse, has befallen them.
The Russian Foreign Ministry, on the other hand, says Russia has placed 61 more U.S. officials and leading defense and media executives on its stop list, banning them from entering the country. The list includes heads of leading defense firms, media platforms, rating agencies, and aircraft and shipbuilding companies, as well as individual U.S. State Department officials. The ministry said the sanctions were in response to the ever-expanding U.S. sanctions against Russian political and public figures, as well as representatives of domestic businesses. U.S. officials on the list include Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, Trade Representative Catherine Tai, and Head of the Office of Sanctions Coordinators James O'Brien. And a UN top official has warned the Security Council that as conflict in Ukraine passes the 100-day mark, there are mounting allegations of sexual violence. Pramila Patin, the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, told Council members that due to active hostilities, mass internal displacements, the breakdown of referral pathways for services, and stigma associated with sexual violence, alleged victims have often been unable or unwilling to report to law enforcement authorities or service providers. As of 3rd June, the Human Rights Monitoring Team of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has received reports of 124 alleged acts of conflict-related sexual violence occurring against women, girls, men, and boys in Chernihiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Zakarpattia, and Zhytomyr regions. Verification of cases is said to be ongoing. The Russian permanent representative, Vasily Nebenzia, said that the same allegations have been made in the past, but so far no evidence was provided.
Mr. Ambassador of the Russian Federation, let's be honest. The Kremlin is using food supplies as a stealth missile against developing countries. The dramatic consequences of Russia's war are spilling over across the globe, and this is driving up food prices, pushing people into poverty and destabilizing entire regions. And Russia is solely responsible for this food crisis, Russia alone, despite the Kremlin's campaign of lies and disinformation.
And Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, says about 60% of Ukrainians need psychological help as a result of the war, adding that Kiev was working on establishing a national support system. Mrs. Zelensky said that the figure was mentioned in a working group of the National Program for Mental Health and Psychological Support, which she said had gone from negotiations with First Ladies of various countries and the World Health Organization to the creation of a specific action plan at the state level. She said the action plan included having representatives of WHO helping Ukraine establish a model for a system of care and delivering training to family doctors, psychologists, social workers, and teachers in rapid methods of psychological support. Let's take a look at some of the sports emanating from this conflict. Estonia's tennis star Anett Kontaveit has announced that she's parting ways with Russian coach Dmitry Tuzanov after she admitted that both of them were struggling to cope with the fallout of the invasion of Ukraine. Tuzanov began coaching Kontaveit in August of 2021 after he retired as a professional player 4 years earlier. He has worked with a number of leading women players, including Russia's Elena Vesnina and Arina Sabalenka. The Russian Football Union has lodged a complaint to FIFA over the shirts worn by Ukraine in Sunday's World Cup qualifying playoff final defeat to Wales, relating to the inclusion of Crimea on an outline of the country's borders. The Crimean region was annexed by Russia in 2014, although its status is disputed, with the majority of the international community still deeming it part of Ukraine. This prompted the imposition of sanctions from nations including the United States and Canada, as well as collective measures from the European Union. And finally, just days after Russia attacked Ukraine, on February the 24th, Finnish entrepreneur C.C. Merberg found herself scouring the internet for courses that could teach her skills to help defend Finland in case of a military attack. Within weeks, Merberg was on a course intended for reservists and learning how to use a gun and move on a battlefield. The war in Ukraine has caused great alarm in Finland, which shares a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, and during World War II fought 2 wars against the Soviet Union, which cost it a tenth of its territory. Spurred on by the invasion, Finland broke with decades of domestic defense and security policy last month when it applied for membership of the NATO military alliance. Finland's Women's National Emergency Preparedness Association says demands for courses had shot up since February. The trend is in keeping with Finland's long tradition of wartime volunteering amongst women who, in contrast to men, are not required to do military service. Around 19% of Finland's 13,000 professional military personnel are women, according to data from the military, although only 1 to 2% of conscripts are female.
Että jostain saisi valmistelemaan, että minä saisin vaikka tulen aikaiseksi. Termi on aika todennäköinen, jos siellä ei ole suojaa, jos joutuu vähän pitempään. Annus vei Suomesta. Kyllä te voitte ainoastaan hallita itseään. Mutta kuinka moni harjoittelee joka päivä?
What a man can do, a woman can equally do. It's on that package. We wrap it up for this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akere-Duluale. The show is back tomorrow at 9 o'clock, but there'll be an update at 5 o'clock within the world today, so do watch out for that. For now, to have a pleasant Tuesday ahead. Good morning.